So Lisa Ireland, welcome to the Writes4Women Convo Couch.
Thanks for having me, Pam. It's nice to chat to you again.
It is. It's been a while. I think you were on one of the years we had COVID and we were doing those sort of quick book new release type things. It might have been when Shirley Sullivan came out, I think.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
Seems like forever ago
It does
now.
feel like a while ago. But really good to have you on, of course, and to chat about your lovely new book out tomorrow as we're recording on, what day is it today? It's Monday, the 9th of January, I believe. So congratulations on the one and only Dolly Jamieson. It's lovely. Dolly is the most fabulous character, and I can't wait to talk to you about her. But before we get into that, could you take us back in time, if you like, to how you actually got into writing and how your writing career has evolved since then?
Sure. I always have wanted to be a writer. I think I listen to Writes4Women, and I think this is quite a common theme amongst writers, is that started off always reading, was that nerdy bookwormy kid at school, really, and spending a lot of time in the school library. But I always wanted to be a writer rather. I was a reader, and I always wanted to be a writer. And I even used to produce little books myself, and so I've actually got some still that I used to make from the time I was quite small, and I used to sell them to my members of my family for 5 cents. And when I got a bit older, my dad had a photocopier in the shed. Like, he had this like home office in our garden shed, and he had this really old photocopier in there, which I was not allowed to use, but I used to sneak out there. I used to write stories and then photocopy them and sell them to people at school.
Oh, so you were very enterprising, Liz.
I was into self-publishing before it was a thing. So yeah, I was definitely always wanted to be a writer. But in the time where I grew up, so it sounds like I'm ancient, but it was back in the 70s and 80s when I was at school. It really wasn't a time, where I grew up anyway, where you thought about being a writer being an actual real job. I didn't know any writers.
It wasn't a career path, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was like writers were these magical beings that came from somewhere else. And actually, I suppose in a lot of ways they did come from somewhere else, because I don't know about you, Pam, but when I was growing up, the stories that we heard came from other places, from UK, from America. There weren't a lot of Australian voices in fiction. And didn't really occur to me that being a writer was something that I could do. So I grew up to do a law degree. I didn't finish the degree because I was terrible at it, but I started a law degree, then discovered that I actually wanted to be a teacher, and I taught for many years, loved teaching. But when I had kids and I was home on parental leave, I started dabbling. I'd always written in journals. I'd always loved to write, and I used to just write and tell the kids stories, write little stories for my kids and tell them those. And then when I was on family leave with my third son, I just started to write, and I thought that I would really like to have a go at having a career where I could do it, work from home. And so that was the start of it. But it took me from then, that was around about, he was born in 2003, and I fiddled around on my own for a couple of years and then did a creative writing course, encouraged by a friend. And
because we've had a very similar career path then, because I taught for many years and I had my third daughter in 2000, and that's the year I started my master's in creative writing, and then got into writing in the early 2000s as well.
So funny, isn't it? And I think it is. I was talking to a group of writers about this the other day, like actually in person. We actually got together. It was so exciting to be talking to somebody in the flesh rather than on Zoom. But we were talking about that whole idea of writing not being a real job, or people not, including us at times, not believing that it's a real job, and not actually honoring the work and understanding that it is actually a lot of work and deserving of remuneration. But so that was what I did. I did a course, and it took 10 years though from the time that I first seriously started to write something for publication until the time I got published. So I joined.
So when was your first book published?
2014. So I got picked up got my first contract in 2013 after a conference at the Romance Writers of Australia in Fremantle.
Yep.
Went to that and pitched to Escape Publishing. So that's the other thing, is that my very first book did not go directly to print. It was a digital first publisher. It did go to print quite quickly, that story, with the main publisher, which was Harlequin, but it started off as a digital first publication. And from there I was off. And so I've brought out, I think this is my 7th book.
You've written across a few different genres, haven't you, Lisa?
Yeah, I have. I started off in rural romance. That was accidental. I didn't even know that rural romance was a genre.
With me. That's what happened with me too.
And I lived in the city at the time when I wrote it, but I had lived in the country, and my family originally is from the country, and I live in the country again now. So I've always got that country girl heart, even though I love the city and have lived in the city for most of my life. But I wrote a story that was semi-based, a little bit inspired by my time as a country school teacher. It's not about teaching, but it was about a city girl going to the country, which of course is a well-worn trope in rural romance. But I didn't know that because I hadn't read any rural romance, didn't even know it was a genre. But I wrote this story, and then that got picked up. And of course, when you write something, it actually sold really well, that book. And so once I got picked up for that, the publisher wanted more of the same. So I wrote another 2 rural romances. And then it wasn't that I didn't want to write rural romance anymore. It was just that I had a story that I was burning to tell, and it didn't happen to be a rural romance. It was a women's fiction story about 4 women. And I wrote that, and then the next story again was another women's fiction. And now I've deviated slightly again because I'm now writing dual timeline historical fiction, but near historical fiction. So fiction set in the 1960s and 70s. I've just written another one of those. So whether I haven't, that one's not submitted yet, but anywhere. But yeah, when that eventually comes out, that's another one that's set in this time in the 1950s. Okay. So I love that era.
Yeah. No, and I want to talk to you about that whole dual timeline thing too, because I love the way that really pushes the story along and really keeps the reader engaged too. I think that works really well for all that. But your last 2 books, so Dolly and your previous book, The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, we're introduced to a couple of older characters too. How has that kind of come about for you, this focus on an older woman character?
I think it's really interesting as you age, so I'm in my 50s now, and as you age, you become, I think I've become more acutely aware of the invisibility of older women, not necessarily people in my age bracket, although there can be that sort of invisibility once you are past the dewy glow of youth. Once you get into your 40s, you do become less visible to certain sections of the community. But I started to be irritated by representations of older women in fiction, particularly on screen. Not so much, I think there's some good examples, particularly now, and on the screen as well, but in written fiction, there are becoming more and more great examples of quite strong older female protagonists. But when I set out to write Shirley, I felt there was a lack of that available for people to read. And I started thinking about people, like I lost my mum. My mum was quite young when she died. And I started thinking about, particularly when I wrote The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, I was thinking about gentle feminism, about quiet feminism, about the people who raised women like me. I consider myself a feminist, and I was raised to think that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And yet my mum was a homemaker her whole life, and not someone that people probably would have thought as a feminist, but she's the one that imbued me with all the values that I have. And so she has given me the opportunities that she didn't have. And so I wanted to honor that. And so I love the idea of the freedom of old age too, of getting to a point as you age, getting to a point where you think, stuff this, I'm going to do whatever the heck I want. I'm sick of all these constraints and being treated this way. I've looked after kids, or I've raised a family, or I've had a career, and I have had all these expectations. And now I'm 75 or I'm 80 or however old I am, and I'm just going to do what I want to do. And so I wanted to honor that. Dolly is quite a feisty character. And so there's quite a lot of that built into Dolly. Yeah. So I just love, and I hate also that representation of the grandmother stereotype that we see. We see women often in their 60s, 70s, and 80s represented as that idea of a woman sitting on a porch in a rocker knitting or doing needlepoint and or in the kitchen with an apron on, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with those pursuits. But I was taking notice when the other day, when people, I'm lost for the name all of a sudden, the designer that recently died.
Vivienne Westwood.
Vivienne Westwood,
Yeah.
thank you. I could have been that is senior brain at work right there. Yeah, when Vivienne Westwood died, and she was the same age that my mother would be if my mother was still alive. Right. And I was looking at those photos of her, even recent photos, and she's dressed in really, I know she was a designer, but she's dressed in these avant-garde clothes, and she's got this punk rock attitude. And she was in her late 70s or 80s. I can't remember how old she was. She must have been 80, because my mum would be 81, 82. Anyway, yeah. So I just think that we think about women in this particular way, and yet women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are as diverse as the rest of the population. We're not all grandmothers. And if we are grandmothers, we're not a particular type of grandmother.
Yeah.
Just because we have offspring who have offspring doesn't mean that we're sitting on the porch in a rocking chair. So yeah. I want to represent that in fiction.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm a grandmother, and I'm definitely not on the porch in the rocking chair. So
no, you are not. And I'm not a grandmother. It's so funny because I know women who are much younger than me that are grandmothers, and they're still going out to rock concerts, and they're still working, and they're making valuable contributions to their community in all sorts of ways. They're not just sitting around waiting to die, which is the representation that we're often given in fiction or have been. And I want to change that.
Yeah, before we get into talking a little bit more about the book, tell us, just, I guess, give us the blurb or your elevator pitch, whatever you like. Tell us about what the book's about.
Okay, so Dolly is about, it's actually at its heart a story about friendship, which really nearly, no matter what genre, my books are always about relationships.
Isn't it funny? It always comes back to one thing, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so other than the rural romances, all my books are really about friendship in some way or another. And so Dolly is about an unlikely friendship between an elderly woman who finds herself homeless, and she would not ever tell you that she's homeless. She would not describe it that way. She says she's between permanent abodes. So she's a homeless lady that spends a lot of time in her local library keeping warm. And she comes across a woman at the other end of the social spectrum, a woman who's quite well off, but has got her own problems. And Jane is the other character. Jane's in middle age and is facing a crisis in her life and meets Dolly just at the right time. And they form this unlikely friendship, and the friendship is the thing that ultimately heals them both. So yeah, that's basically what
description of it. I think I love that, and that sort of healing connection that they form and the bond they form. It's really beautiful. And from the very beginning, Dolly is this larger than life sort of character, I think in her own mind sometimes too, as well as for the reader. And when we meet her, it's 2019. She's in the library. It's set in London. And we discover quite quickly that she does spend a lot of time in the library. She wheels around her suitcase. We're not sure what's in it to start with. And we think at first that, oh, who is this sweet little old lady? But I love Lisa right at the beginning. We do actually get a pretty strong sense of her. I just wanted to read the first few lines. So it's chapter 1, London, 2019. Good morning, Dolly. How are you today? Fucking freezing, if you must know. And that's in italics because it's her, what she's thinking. I smile at Stacey, the senior librarian, and keep my thoughts to myself. Profanity isn't tolerated in the library. I've learnt that the hard way. I'm quite well, darling. And you? Her lips return my smile, but her eyes are steely. So we get, first of all, this very vivid impression that Dolly is perhaps not all that she seemed, and the reactions from the other characters to her too. I love the variety of reactions that we get that we start to build this picture up about Dolly. So I'm really curious about where Dolly came from for you. What was the inspiration for the character, and how did that then evolve for you?
Look, it's really interesting. And I had this conversation with someone on a podcast the other day, and I started to cry when I told the story. So I'm pre-warning you that I might cry.
Fine. We love
I'm trying to toughen myself up because I'm going to have to tell this story quite a lot over the next few weeks. And I'm trying to thicken my skin. But in 2019, my family, my husband and my youngest son and I went on a trip to Europe. And we went in January. It was very cold. It was a fantastic trip, but it was very cold. And I started to notice as we traveled around the UK, a lot of homeless people, more than I'd ever noticed before. And there's always homeless people if you look for them, but it's that they seem to be everywhere. And I first started taking notice in a place called Chester, where it was particularly cold. And we were out at night, walking around, going to restaurants and whatnot. And I noticed when we were coming back that people were sitting in doorways under awnings, under the streetlights, and they were reading. And I'd never seen so many homeless people reading. I was just like fascinated by this. And I was really concerned because I was thinking, I'm freezing, and I'm freezing even when I'm indoors. How would these people survive? Like, it was really cold. And then we were in Edinburgh in Scotland, and my husband and my son went into a mini mart or a supermarket or something, and I was standing out the front waiting for them, and there was a homeless woman, and she asked me for change, and I was traveling. I didn't have any. And I said to her, I'm so sorry, I don't have any money. My husband's in the shop. I'll ask him when he comes out. And I noticed she was reading a Beth O'Leary novel. Okay. And so I started, and I'd read it. And so I started to talk to her about the book. And we chatted back and forth for a little while. And then David, my husband, came out, and I said, do we have some change? And he said, yes. And we gave it to her. And then she thanked me. And I said, oh, it's nothing. And she said, no, not for the money. She said, that's great. Thanks for the money, but thanks for talking to me. And this is a bit where I cry.
No, I've just got goosebumps as you're saying it.
Yeah, because she said, no one looks at me, let alone talks to me. She said, and she was clearly an articulate, intelligent woman. I don't know what her circumstances were, why she'd ended up being homeless, but she was clearly, by the way she spoke, she was an educated, intelligent person. And we'd had this lovely conversation. And she said, people just won't even make eye contact with me. And she said, it was nice just for 5 minutes to have a real conversation about something other than how cold it is or whatnot. And it made me really think about all the times that I have done that, where I've walked past and I've averted my eyes because it's hard to look at people who are in that situation. And it also made me think about where people we see in those situations, where they've come from, and the assumptions that we make that we would ourselves will never be in that position. And it made me think about, but what if I was? Like, how could that happen? So that, I started thinking about that. And then we came home. And then when I was at home, quite some time later, I was reading an article in the Good Weekend. It was about business in the demographic of women who are beyond, I can't remember if it was 50 or 60 off the top of my head, but it was older women, and they're the fastest growing demographic of homeless people.
I've read that too.
In this country. And it's not, so then when I started to research, I realized it's not just here, that's a phenomenon all around the world. In all developed countries, women who are beyond their mid-50s are in this really vulnerable position. And I was interested to see why. And there's lots of reasons for that. Often people, particularly older women who are in their 70s, 60s, 70s and 80s, often may have interrupted their career or stopped working altogether to raise a family, and they're not been encouraged or not been able to re-enter the workforce. And then if their partner dies or leaves them, they're left in this really vulnerable position. And there's all sorts of other reasons why it happens too. For instance, women generally have less superannuation than male counterparts. They are often in occupations where they're not being paid as well. All sorts of systemic reasons why this happened, but it's a real growing problem. And so Dolly came from the idea of, from the Good Weekend article, there was a woman in there who had worked in TV, and she was now home, and she was an assistant producer. It wasn't as if she was someone who had a very low paying job. She'd been actually quite advanced in her career and had ended up homeless for various reasons. And I was just shocked by that. And I started to think, what's the most unlikely person I could think of to become homeless? And I started to think about movie stars.
Right.
And what if the movie star became, but instead of writing a movie star, and I do not know for the life of me why this is the case, Pam, Dolly came to me as a star of musical theatre.
Okay.
And I have to tell you a secret. I don't like musical theatre.
I was wondering whether it was one of your secret passions after reading the book.
And the funny thing is, I've got a very close writing friend, Kelly Rimmer, and her passion is musical theatre. She was so excited when I was writing this book, and she was certain that I would become a fan of musical theatre while I wrote it. And I do have a much greater appreciation.
Okay.
But I have to say, and I'm sure listeners are going to put their hands over their eyes and shake their heads when they hear this, but I did very recently go to Hamilton, and because I was convinced now that I was now a music, after doing all this research, I thought I'm going to go to Hamilton and I'm going to love it. I'm just going to say I didn't love it.
Okay, can I share a secret too? I didn't love it either. And I love I do like musical theatre.
Awesome. You and me, we're the only two.
Don't hate us out there. Look, I appreciated it. I thought it was amazing what they did. But
me too.
For me, I didn't find it that great as a piece of entertainment. So
I mean, we had really terrible seats because we went at the last minute. So I do think, and they were really uncomfortable. So that probably didn't help. And I do have a much better appreciation of musical theatre since but I tried to make her so many other things. Like I would try and write her as a TV star, and she does dabble in TV a little bit throughout the book, but I tried to make her just a singer. But she really wanted to be this character.
Yeah, she was the triple threat, wasn't she?
And she would not let me write her as anything else but a star of musicals. So that's what she was. But yeah, so that's my very long-winded tale of where she came from.
So it sounds like she's one of those characters that's a bit of a gift for a writer, Lisa. That she was a bit of a conglomeration of a few different ideas, but once you pulled all that together, the character formed herself. And then was she fairly easy to write on the page? Did she just appear and her life fell onto the page for you? Or
yes, as a character, she's really, I feel like I know her really well. And Dolly, the character herself, was easy to write. The book is one of the hardest books I've ever written. And that is because, it's funny because The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan was that book that, and you probably only get one in a lifetime, I think, that book that just fell onto the page. And it's pretty much, as it appears on the shelf, it's pretty much how I wrote it. It's been edited, of course, but it's not, it hasn't been pulled apart and put back together in the way that some books are. And some of my other books have definitely been like that. I wrote Dolly, so that was 2019 that we went away. It was the Australian summer of 2019 when I read that book and read that story in the Good Weekend. And so I started to write the book at the beginning of 2020, and I live in Victoria. COVID happened and we were in lockdown for a really long time. And for some writers found that really great for their creativity, but I didn't. Many writers are introverted, but I'm not. I'm very extroverted and I thrive on the company of others. And I found being in lockdown, I was separate for the first really long lockdown. Our middle son was in Melbourne and we didn't, even though he was only an hour and a half up the road, we didn't see him for 6 months, and he's quite young. And so there were a lot of things. And I understood why we needed to be in lockdown, but it didn't, and I completely supported it. But creatively, it was tricky. And so I think I wouldn't have said so at the time, but I think I might have been like borderline depressed.
Yeah.
Like, when I submitted the draft to my publisher, she came back to me and she said to me, look, there's lots to like, and I love the character of Dolly. There's lots to like in this story. But there's also some parts of it that I'm just not feeling. And she said, I think it's quite dark and it's really just not quite working in the format that it is now. And what I'd done was I'd told it from two different points of view. It was told from Dolly's point of view, but also from Jane's point of view.
Okay.
And Jane's point of view was because Jane's going through quite a crisis and she's depressed, and which hasn't changed in the current book, but it's just told from Dolly's perspective, not from Jane's perspective. Anyway, so it was the publisher said to me, look, I think you could work on this some more. And so what I decided to do was to take Jane's point of view out, because that's where all the dark, depressing sort of stuff was, and tell it all through Dolly's point of view. And that worked, but it was a lot of work to pull that point of view out. And it's also dual timeline. So it's not the present day or in 2019 and the present day at that time. And then Dolly's life from the 1940s forward. And so it was quite complex to pull that other point of view out, and then fiddle with the tense as well, because I've written one in present tense and one in past tense, and that wasn't the case either in the first draft.
Okay.
So it was a lot of work, but the character never changed. So she herself was a joy to write, but the book has been a long, hard slog. You'll see it on the shelf tomorrow when we're recording this. Yeah.
So just picking up on a couple of those points, it is all from Dolly's point of view. As you say, we get the previous timeline, which is her life growing up and how she got to be where she is today. So we jump back to the 1940s. That is told in present tense.
Past tense. The past is told in the past tense, and the present, and the present is told.
That was my question then. Was that your reasoning for that, to make the present more kind of alive and to feel more with the reader on the page? Or
I did the same thing in The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, and in Shirley, it was very deliberate, because in Shirley, the present timeline is a chase. They're being chased by the authorities, and I wanted it to feel breathless and pacey. And then I wanted the past to feel nostalgic and slower and more reflective. And so that was a very deliberate choice. And I hadn't done that in Dolly, because present day timeline is not a chase. There is something at stake. There is something that Dolly is looking for, and that is quite timely because of her age, but it wasn't a chase. And so I think I'd put them both of them were in past tense, but it didn't feel right when I got to the end of that draft. It was not. So Jane's was told in present tense because Jane's storyline was a bit more pressing. And so I told her storyline in present tense. But then when I pulled that out, I was left with two past tense points of view. And I felt as if there wasn't enough differentiation between, because you put the big thing at the start, the year or the date or whatever, but I know as a reader, I ignore all those things. I never read those dates, or I don't absorb them. And so I wanted it to be really clear to the reader what part of the novel they were in, so they're not confused that, oh, where are we now? Who is this? I wanted to know this is the present and this is the past. So that was, so it was a deliberate choice, yes.
So you get that differentiation, So with the dual timeline, Lisa, where we do go back into the past, into her childhood, great, because I'm a lover of backstory when it's used correctly. And it's almost like we have a whole story of backstory here, but we go into it as a completely separate story almost, because Dolly has a different name, and of course it's a previous time period and all that. Did you enjoy writing that part of it and delving into Dolly's backstory and bringing her history to life?
Well, I loved it. I love that time period. It's both of the novels that I've done that way, I've set in a time that, so Dolly would be a similar age, slightly younger than my mum, so they're probably around about my aunt's age. And so I've got source material. I've got my aunt is still alive, and I, for instance, the setting in the beginning of Dolly's childhood in the house that she lives in, I based that on the house that my mum and my aunt grew up in.
Oh, great.
So I in my mind's eye, I can see these places, and I can remember Geelong from the 1960s when I was a small girl and used to be taken in on the bus into the city of Geelong by my nana. They owned this house in Newtown in Geelong, and it's not that far into the city. You'd get on the bus and you'd be in there in 5 minutes. And I remember there's a scene where Dolly is taken to the cinema, and I can remember, obviously it's set in a much earlier time period, but I can remember being a small child and going to the cinema with my grandmother and my mother, and Geelong hadn't changed that much from like the late 40s to the early 60s when I was going there. So I've got that original sort of source material in my head and in photographs, in family photographs. And I love the 1940s, 50s and 60s. It's a real joy to write in that time period for me.
Yeah, yeah. And Lisa, are you someone who do you write all of one like timeline and then divide it up, or are you alternating between them as you're going through the writing process?
I'm laughing, Pam, because I wish I knew the answer to this question. Every time I do this, I do it differently. With Dolly, I wrote it. Actually, I'll start with Shirley. With Shirley, I wrote it as it is. So I would write one chapter in the present day and then one chapter in the past, and the chapters alternate like that. With Dolly, I did that, but I had Jane's point of view originally as well. So it was a bit more mixed up. And in the end, it had to all be pulled apart and put back together. But I did write it that way. So I didn't write one storyline. But I've just completed yesterday a new book, which is set partially in the 1950s and partially in the 1990s. And I ended up writing the whole 1990s storyline in one sitting and the whole 1950s storyline in a separate document. And I've just finished marrying that together. That has been a complete pain in the neck. And you might be able to see behind me, I know.
You Post-it notes there.
I know people listening might be able to see this, but behind me, I've got a big wardrobe, and I've got about 40 or 50 scene cards stuck on there, and that's so that I can move them around. And I know Scrivener exists, so I know I could do it in Scrivener, but I'm not a Scrivener girl.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes that hands-on thing, I think you connect with your brain in a different way when you're doing the hands-on thing, the practical.
Yeah, absolutely. I never write story with a pen and paper, but I do write character notes and backstory and scene cards and that sort of stuff. I do love pen and paper for that, because I think there's something about that makes my brain engage in a different way. So so all those hundreds of scene cards behind me, it took ages to get the story, having written it in two separate settings, to meld it all back together so it makes sense as one narrative.
Yeah.
Because the thing that you're really wanting in a dual narrative is that you're wanting the stories to mirror each other and to drive the whole story, the whole arc of the whole book forward at the same time. So you're not wanting and revealing things too. Like I realized that I had carved it up in a certain way that things in the present day were revealing things that had happened in the past that hadn't happened in the past story.
Okay. Yeah.
I can't say that there because that hasn't happened in the past yet. And so I think if I write another one, I would go back to writing them alternatively rather than, but that's just me. I know other people do it, and I'm not much of a plotter. And so I tangle myself up in these sorts of dilemmas all the time.
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Me too.
Are you good with timelines? I'm terrible with timelines.
Timelines just do my head in. I usually end up getting like a big scrapbook and physically doing a timeline. I have tried using the Plotter app which isn't bad, the Plotter program, but I just find getting a big bit of butcher's paper or a big scrapbook or something and actually writing the timeline out. And every single book I say to myself, this time I'm getting the timeline right from the beginning. And I never do. Never.
I never do either. And this time I downloaded software. It's called Eon, and I've actually recommended it to other people because I got excited when I first got it, and I thought this is going to be the answer to all my problems. It's only the answer to your problems if you put the things in the timeline. Because when I'm writing, I don't want to be distracted. And so, like, when I get a roll on, I just go and go. And I think to myself, I really should put this in the timeline. I'll do it later. And then later never comes, or it's much later, and then I can't remember. So, yeah.
I know. And look, I just find you sound like you're like me. Every book's different. I don't have like a particular process that this is how I start it, this is how I go through it, this is how I finish it. Every time it's different, which is very frustrating.
The drafting is different for me. I get to a certain point, which is the point I'm at now, or once the first draft is finished, then all the steps from there are always pretty much the same. But the first draft, how I get that first draft, 7 books, 7 or 8. I've just finished the 8.
Yeah.
So 8 books, and then a couple of others that will never see the light of day. So probably about 10, and I've never done it exactly the same way twice.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to do it.
No, I know, I'm hearing you. So just on that, Lise, with the whole, when you sit down, so you've got your idea for Dolly, you sat down, do you then tend to write the whole draft through without doing too much revision along the way, or are you someone that stops and revises a bit as you go? What's your process?
I do not revise as I go. I used to, in my very early books, in the rural romances, I used to do that. I don't do it because particularly for women's fiction, I think it might be slightly different if you're writing romance, because not that it's easier, but because all writing is hard, no matter what genre you are writing. But in the romances, there's a structure, a superimposed structure that you are going to stick to, because there has to be there's generally, if you're writing a standard sort of romance, like a rural romance, there's going to be generally 2 protagonists, and there will be a certain sort of an arc, and you end up with a happy ending. And so within that, there's not too much deviation. It's like you can tell fantastic stories, but there's not going to be a huge amount of deviation. But in women's fiction, you can go anywhere. And so in terms of revising as you go, I used to, but I've learned not to bother, because I could be polishing and revising something and fixing something that ends up on the cutting room floor. So an example of that is in the book that I'm writing now. My first messy draft that was all over the place, where I still had the timelines in the 1990s and the 1950s, that came in at 111,000 words. And as it sits now, it's 101,000 words. So 10,000 words have gone and more. But there's whole chapters in there that I just went, this is just waffle. I don't need this. And I just completely took the whole chapter out. If I was going back and revising that so that the sentences were perfect and that the tension was right and the pacing was right in that chapter, and it would be a lot harder to let go of it at the other end, to go, if it's this beautiful, pretty polished thing, you're like, oh, but it's so good, it's so nice. Whereas it's still messy and rubbishy, and so I can go, great, there's 3,000 words I can get rid of. I just find it's more efficient, and I mentor people, as I know you do too. And one of the things that's one of my tips. I'm not pedantic about telling people how they should write in those sorts of ways, because everyone has their process. And for some people, if revising as they go, if that makes them feel confident and good about the work and they're getting results, then by all means, don't mess with your process. I'm not someone that would prescribe, I do this, so therefore you must do it too. But if people are not sure, or if I find that they're really obsessing, they're not getting very far, and it's because they're obsessing about getting the first chapter or the first couple of chapters right, I encourage them to give this a go and say, what if you just kept writing on and left the revision until later? And many people find that very freeing when they allow themselves to let go of that idea of perfection in the first draft.
It's that whole thing too, isn't it, of learning the story as you go. You're finding things out about your characters, and you're finding things out about the story, and if you keep stopping and starting, then I think, for me anyway, sounds like the same for you, it interrupts that creative process, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you never, like, right up until towards the end, like, when I never really know the beginning properly until I've written the end. So I've rewritten the beginning of this latest book several times and since I finished it, because like I wrote it when I rewrote the beginning once I'd finished the first draft. Then I went through and did the structural draft, and more changes happened, and now I'm satisfied with the ending. I can go, oh, now I know what the beginning should look like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when you had to pull out that whole section of Jane's character, please, was that like traumatic? Because I know there'll probably be people listening thinking, oh no, I couldn't take out like a whole section or a whole threads of the book. How did you feel about that? Or are you just someone that, no, that needs to happen, I'm doing it?
Oh, look, there was a moment where it was just about the amount of work that I knew that was ahead of me. I was a bit daunted by, my goodness, this is going to be a lot of work. But I'm very pragmatic about my stories, as in I'm a commercial fiction writer. I want to sell books. I want to make the publishers happy, and I want to make readers happy. I want to tell the stories that I want to tell. Like, I don't want to tell stories that are not in my wheelhouse. So I don't want someone to say to me, you must write a book about A, B, and C. That's not my go. But within what I like to write about, I'm really open to help and editorial criticism. I love working with an editor. One of the gifts of working in traditional publishing, and also can be also with a great editor in self-publishing too, if you find the right editor. But for me, one of the gifts of working in traditional publishing is having someone, a professional who does this all the time, that's what they do for a living, who's got a great eye and who loves your work, who has chosen you to work with because they love your voice, they love your work, they love your characters and stories, and they know how to make it even better. And I was actually excited I was daunted by the amount of work. I really was. And I thought, oh, this is going to take forever. But I was encouraged by my publisher's comments about the things that she did about the book. And I could see, I had a long conversation. We had an hour and a half phone conversation about the book and how it could be improved and whatnot. And I could actually see her vision for it. And I got excited because then I could see that the book was actually going to be a lot. No person in their right mind wants to hear, this would be great if you could just do another 1,000 hours work on it. Nobody wants it. What we all want to hear is, this is the best book I've ever read and it doesn't need editing at all. But I'm pragmatic. I know that's not going to happen. And if I'm going to have edits, I want them to be ones that are going to improve the book. And I really, truly believe that she was right and that the book is 100 times better than that first draft.
And the thing I love about having it all from Dolly's point of view is that there's this mystery around Jane, because the reader only finds out about what's happening with Jane as Dolly finds out. And Jane is very circumspect about revealing much about her life, certainly until we get to a certain point and she starts to share more things with Dolly. So for me, that really created more tension around the character, and it made me want to read on to find out, oh, what's going on with Jane? Dolly's starting to suspect different things. Is she right? So I loved that part of it.
Thank you. And that is a really good point, because I do think in that first draft, some of that tension was not there. Because we did know even though Dolly didn't know, we knew what was driving the behaviour of Jane. And so therefore there was not that pull through of, I wonder what has happened. I wonder why what is it that's making her this way? So it really improved the book. And that's the eye of someone, the benefit of having a professional look at it and say, look, I really think it would be better off without this. Yeah, it was hard, but I'm happy that I did it.
Yeah. So just before we wrap up, Lisa, and you are going to be doing the 4 curly questions for me for the January Patreon members. So thank you for that. But just in terms of, we talked before about some of the issues in the book, the homelessness, and also very much the situation of women comes through in different ways. The way that women can be forced into a situation or have to deal with situations in life that can be very traumatic, that are not of their own making. And of course, these things happen to men too, but particularly in the characters and their lives as they unfold, we see the way that these things operate for both Jane and particularly for Dolly. And I think there's so much in there in terms of the themes of the story, the stories that we tell ourselves in order to keep going, and the stories that we tell other people so that we can keep going. There's the homelessness, there's the sort of issue of grief and loss and dealing with that, and how do you move on from that and survive. As you mentioned earlier, there are these darker aspects of the story, but you have this very light touch with them, and I think partly to do with Dolly's character and her persona. But how did you go about balancing those dark and light things, even after you'd pulled Jane's voice out? Was that something you had to then play around with?
I think Dolly herself, the character, is a really optimistic person. And I don't actually think I am, to be honest. I think she's almost the opposite of me. I'm an anxious person, and I worry a lot about things. And so it was a joy to write someone who just, every problem she came up against would treat it as a challenge to be it was just a problem to be solved. It was just a little challenge in the day, a speed on the road to where she was going. And even when things really dark and desperate for her, she never gives up. And I think part of that was I was writing that for myself, to tell myself, look, life is good. Life is good. Don't no matter what.
Because you were writing during COVID too, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It was so ultimately, and I hope other people see this in it. It's ultimately a story of great hope and resilience, and basically saying that yes, life can be tough and it can serve up some really terrible situations, but there's always hope. While we still live and breathe, there's always hope, and things can always turn around. And yeah, I think one of the things that, I don't know about you, but I really dislike myself in fiction is being lectured, or being, when an author is really passionate about something and they're really banging their point home to you. I do feel now very passionate about homelessness, and I've always been passionate about women's issues. And but I feel as if that message will be better received by people if it's told in a gentle and humorous way, rather than beating people over the head with my views. And so I hope I've achieved that, because I don't achieve it necessarily in first draft. And I was thinking about, because I've written another book that's about women's issues, and those 10,000 words that got taken out, a lot of those is me banging on about issues. And I thought, the reader doesn't really need to hear
that. You can do that in the first draft, or anything in the first draft. Actually, I can't remember where I heard this, but I wrote it down. I made a note for myself the other day, and I thought, and again, a lot of this stuff we know, but it's just sometimes when you hear it in a different way. It was somebody talking about writing, and they said, with this whole idea of exploring an issue or making a point, write the point that you want to make at the top of the scene, and then never ever say it in the scene. So that's that telling at the top that you're not going to do, but then you're showing it through the interactions of the characters.
100% agree with that. And I think that the stories that have meant the most to me, that have given me those messages, have never been soapboxy. They've never been lectury or laboured the point too much. They've just been, those themes have been gently woven through. I hope I've achieved that. I'm not 100% sure that I do. Because you never know. It's in every reader will experience Dolly's story differently. And so I hope it resonates with a lot of people. We'll just have to wait and see.
It certainly resonated with me, Lise. I loved it. And before we just wrap up this section, you are a writing mentor, as you mentioned, and you do mentor emerging writers and writers at different stages of the career. Now, this might be a little bit too hard. It's not part of the 4 curly questions. It's just one for the general podcast audience. But if you had to give one piece of advice to writers, what would that be?
Don't give up. And that sounds, it's such a twig thing to say, but it's that there's actually some thought behind that, because I see the people who come to me are generally wanting to be published by a traditional publisher. They're wanting to be published in commercial fiction. And but sometimes they'll say to me, I've been going for so long and I haven't had any success. And I'll say, how long have you been writing for? And seriously, towards publication? And they'll say, oh, 2 years or a year or whatever. And I'm like, that's nothing.
Yeah.
I think in terms, it's not nothing in terms of your life. Of course, that's a lot of effort, but we're playing a really long game. You can write your whole life. It's not like something that is not like a physical pursuit. If we were marathon runners, at some point your body might break down. But for most of us, even if my hands are old and arthritic now, but there's dictation software. There's all sorts. What I'm saying is that whatever you've still got a sound mind, you're able to write. And it's not a race. The more you live and the more you learn, the more you've got to offer as a writer. And so my real advice is that if you truly want to be traditionally published and you've been going for 5 or 10 years, just don't give up. It's not over until you give up.
Yeah.
So you don't. And if you've been going that long, then you really do want to be a writer, and writing is part of who you are. And so it's something that you should pursue anyway. There's so many other things I could say, but that would be the key thing. Don't give up, because success could be just around the corner.
Yeah. Yeah. You never know what's around the corner. And I think determination and resilience is very much key factors in it, aren't they?
You're going to need it. You're going to need that it doesn't end when you get your first, as you and I both know, it doesn't end when you get your first contract. It's a big roller coaster, this writing industry. And so you're going to need all that resilience to keep going throughout your career. There are lots of ups and there are lots of downs, but if you want to do it, then you just have to hang in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Great advice, Lisa. We are going on to chat about the 4 curly questions, but for general listeners who are on the Writes for Women podcast, where can they find you online?
Oh, I am everywhere. Not on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, but I am on Instagram as Lisa Island Books. My website is lisaislandbooks.com. I am on Facebook as Lisa Island, and that's probably Lisa Island Books too. I'm not really sure, but I'm there. You'll find me. So yeah, but not on TikTok. I'm not good on that. I'm not good with the videos.
No.
Videos okay, but not the.
Yeah. No, I'm the same. I'm lurking there at the moment. But of course, Dolly is out tomorrow, so she's out as of the 10th of January.
Yep.
And available in all good bookstores and retailers, and online in audio as well, and ebook. And you are doing some publicity, some tours in February, Lise.
Yeah, if people go to my website, that's usually updated under the events tab. But yes, I'm in my local area of Gippsland and East Gippsland. So I've got some in Sale, some in Bairnsdale, and then I've got a couple in Melbourne. I'm coming up to New South Wales to go to Orange and Dubbo, Cowra, a few places around there. So I'm Geelong, so I'm all over the place. So just people can go to the website.
Yeah, pop on the website and have a look. Thanks so much, Lisa, and good luck with Dolly.
Thanks so much for having me, Pam.